Have a day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. I'm Cara from the Guam Department of Agriculture, and I'll be passing it off in a bit to Zach from the CNMI Division of Coastal Resources Management. We're going to be talking about mangroves in Guam and Saipan, just a little bit about their overall status and some potential restoration projects. So quick review, mangroves are intertidal trees. They live between the high tide and low tide marks. Some are more salt tolerant and live more often submerged in salt water, and some are not so salt tolerant and live a little more landwards or near sources of fresh water. They're a really important habitat for marine and terrestrial species, including reptiles, birds, insects, fish, marine invertebrates. They're often detritus-based ecosystems, so not that many things eat the mangrove leaves directly, but they might eat them as they start to break down into organic matter, and that organic matter feeds a rich diversity of microbes and benthic algae on the surface of mangrove mud. They have strong connections to nearby terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So if you look at the origin of mangrove soils, some of it is from the mangrove organic matter itself, but oftentimes it's also from terrestrial sources or includes seagrass organic matter. And they sequester huge amounts of carbon, so they're really important for fighting climate change. In Guam, we have many mangrove species, but the four most common genera include Rhizophora with their arching crop roots, as well as some trap roots that come down from above, Abyssinia with their pencil roots that stick straight out of the ground, Gregaria with their kind of knobby knee-like roots, and Lunitra with these looping lateral roots. We also have some other kind of mangrove or mangrove associates. So there's coastal strand plants like the hibiscus or pago that live really close to the seashore and are pretty salt tolerant. We have riverine plants, so that includes the nipa palm, which is in freshwater areas usually, and mangrove associates that include this fern. So really big diversity, but I'll be focusing more on our seaward species due to my position being more focused on coral reef management. Mangroves also often reproduce with propagules, so these are a little different from seeds. This would still be attached to the parent plant. This would be a Rhizophora propagule. And the baby plant starts growing while still attached to the parent plant. So if you were to kind of uncap this portion, you would find little baby furled up leaves inside. They may drop off, float a while in the water until they anchor somewhere and start to take root. Rhizophora propagules tend to look like these string bean shapes, Abyssinia more like these lima beans, Grucaria a little bit more stout, and Lunitra actually don't have propagules, they have normal seeds, which can remain dormant for a while. If we look at mangrove coverage, on the southern coast we have some fringing mangroves. In 1993 and 1975, just kind of written reports indicated that they existed from Chowton Point to Suzapi River, so from these 2 points. And then more recently, in 2016, using NOAA CCAP data, we have this green coverage area. And then a University of Guam Marine Lab report also showed a narrow fringe extending in this yellow area. So we actually might have a little bit more mangrove coverage along this coast than what was reported back in 1993 and 1975. And there's also some mangroves area in this Malilog Point towards this area. So if we look even further back at this map in 1944, you would see this symbology along the coast, which might be mangroves since it looks a little different from the palm tree symbology. If that's the case, they would be extending all the way towards this river mouth, which would be over here. So that area would have had mangroves, so that might be some areas to restore for aiming for this kind of past restoration goal. And in Upper Harbor, we also have some different mangrove areas. We have Sasso Bay, which has a greater diversity of species and is the biggest area. We have the Atchitono wetland, which has this strand of Abyssinia alba, almost pure strand, and was reported in 1993 as the most developed mangrove forest. And then we also have Abo Cove. Looking close to Sasso Bay, here you can see aerial photography from 1974. This light area is that Abyssinia alba. You can see that in Google Maps still today. Here we have the Stark area, which is the Rhizophora lining the coast, mostly Rhizophora, a lot of Rhizophora, and that's also true today. You can see that on Google Maps. Our 1944 map shows very different coverage since that little island, the Marianas Yacht Club Island, wasn't even created yet. And you can see some of that mangrove symbology along the coast. but not as much perhaps as what we have today. But then again, this is not meant to be a biological map, so it just might not accurately reflect mangrove areas. In this area, we've had past oil spills. Here you can see people mopping up an oil spill that occurred in the 1980s and some planted young rhizophora as a result. Another oil spill and planting projects occurred again around 1983. And more recently, there have been other restoration projects after other impacts like typhoons, specifically by Jessica Gross. You can see the difference in this aerial photography from 1994 to 2011. And looking more recently at Google Maps, you can see it's kind of closing itself in a little bit. One concern in this area might be sea level rise. Mangroves can handle salt water, but if they're in poorly drained soils, they can grow in this stunted form as opposed to this more well-developed form, and they may be more stressed. So that's something to keep in mind. If we look at super low tide, here we can see the mangroves almost are in these dry spots, so they might be elevating themselves by collecting sediment and producing organic matter. So they might be able to keep up with sea level rise. That's just something we have to keep in mind with any kind of restoration or conservation efforts. And then overall restoration strategies, I just mentioned this. We want to develop methods for Bulgaria and Abyssinia. They're a little bit more difficult to grow and have had more poor success compared to Rhizophora. Planting in clumps is helpful. By doing that, we help them deal with anoxic soils. They all put oxygen to the soil, and that can reduce poisoning by hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide. And we can also plant among the roots of any cut down mangroves as well. That helps protect them from wave energy, which is another big thing, especially along our fringing mangroves. They can get knocked down by coconuts and branches. So reviewing some different priorities, you might be thinking about Rhizophora. If you plant that, those roots are really good at providing habitat and they're relatively easy to plant. Abyssinia, it's a potential pioneer species and it's supposed to be hardy and resilient to salty conditions. That might be good for in the light of sea level rise and climate change. Bulgaria, we might want to help that species out a little bit because they've been impacted by the invasive brown tree snake. If you look at this chart over here, you can see between Guam and Saipan, Guam has much fewer pollinator visits per Bulgaria tree per day, and Saipan is way higher, and most of those visits are by this bird, the Micronesian honeyeater, represented by this light color. Guam, dark color mostly, represented by insects, which aren't really as effective as pollinators. Bulgaria has this special pollination mechanism where pollen kind of gets triggered and explodes. So that's concerning. We might want to help Bulgaria out, or at least develop methods so that if their populations decline, we can help restore them. And then we have other less common species such as the Nipa palm, which we might want to focus a little energy on to increase diversity and make sure they don't go locally extinct. And with that, I'll pass it off to Zach, who will be talking about mangroves in Saipan.
So in the CNMI, mangroves are much less biodiverse and extensive than what we see in Guam. And in fact, when we talk about mangroves in CNMI, we're generally talking about the mangrove habitat, which is the Bulgaria generalized and dominated mangrove stand. So these are limited to Saipan, and particularly the western side of Saipan and the Sugao and the West Top Chow watersheds. And all in all, there's about 9 acres of fringing and estuary mangroves in the CNMI. So there's actually 4 different species that can be classified as mangrove, but again, when we're talking about mangroves, we're generally talking about the mangrove ecosystem, which is Bulgaria generalized and dominated. As Cara went over, there's also numerous native and non-native mangrove associates that are also present. So I'll just focus your attention on the left where we see the Bulgaria generalized. Again, it's the one species that forms extensive mangrove ecosystem stands, and it's our most mangrove in the CNMI. Interestingly, there is evidence of 3 locally extinct species, particularly Lunaceria latoria, and then possibly Rhizophora apiculata and Lucrinata. This research is on Saipan in particular, so there's no evidence of the other islands. So again, for all the species for Saipan here. So one study by Athens and Ward in Lake Sisupe, doing sediment cores and looking at pollen samples, they found specifically Lunaceria latoria pollen, as well as 2 unidentified species of Rhizophora. So we're talking, 8,000 to about 1,000 years ago. And this is corroborated by an earlier study by Butler just north of Sisupe on Saipan in Sugao watershed, where they again found Rhizophora pollen. This was overlapping that Sisupe timescale. So there does seem to be evidence of Rhizophora, at least as a genus, presence So what happened to it? It's hard to pinpoint exactly, although the decrease in these mangroves does match up with the appearance of charcoal in the sediment samples, suggesting human presence, human settlement. So using mangroves for any number of purposes. It's good wood for building, for charcoal, that sort of thing. But it also matches up with a decrease in sea level at that period. So closing off some of those protected bays, for example, Sasupe Lake was once a bay. So once the sea level decreased, it closed that off and it became a brackish or freshwater environment. So less habitat overall for mangroves than possible cutting of mangroves for human use. So on the right, you see Luminicera Victoria with nice red flowers. Those distinctly found in those pollen cores. And then on the left, I'm highlighting Rhizophora mucronata and Apiculata because those are the closest Rhizophora, both found on Guam to Saipan. So likely candidate for what was once here, just based off of distance for dispersal. So mangroves, of course, have many amazing adaptations. In particular here, for overcoming vicariance, they have buoyant, salt-tolerant seas or propagules, and one study showed Rhizophora apiculata and mucronata in particular, those propagules can remain viable in saltwater for 89 and 150 days, respectively. So, you know, if they are to be carried by currents or what have you, then it gives them that amount of time to make that journey to a different place, to disperse and settle on a new island, for example. So a likely route for dispersal for Guam and the CNMI is through insular Southeast Asia, through Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, possibly island hopping, you know, via Palau or any other islands in the region. And so we're talking about a distance of hundreds or 1,000 miles to make that journey. And again, they can remain viable for a few months at sea. So assuming the currents are right, storm event, what have you, the opportunity for dispersal is there, and it seems to have happened. And so if we were to presume that they naturally disperse to Guam, where there's hundreds of miles, then it's not much of a leap to imagine them making that journey either directly to Saipan, about 140 miles, or island hopping through the archipelago. So again, at present, Guam has that richer biodiversity, and they have these species still, the Luminicera Littoria, Rhizophora apiculata, and mucronata, and it's a likely source for dispersal back when those overcame that vicariance thousands of years ago. So at present, the CNMI Division of Coastal Resources Management is planning mangrove restoration here on Saipan and the West Tabachow and Sugao watersheds, including nursery establishment, propagation, and outplanting. So this does include the idea of collection and import of those extinct or extirpated species of mangroves, the Luminicera, the Rhizophora, from Guam and bringing it to CNMI. So the reasoning for this is that the present species, the Brugueria generaliza, is not really what we call a frontline species. It doesn't do so well in full salinity or with the wave energy out front of mangrove stands. So we've seen pretty static mangrove forest here. There hasn't been a lot of change in the size of our mangrove stands in some years. And the idea is that Rhizophora is a better pioneering early successional species. It's better suited for those frontline conditions. So by bringing that back, we can better emulate the successional dynamics of a mangrove forest in this region and allow the Rhizophora to grow outward with the Brugueria behind it. In addition, diversified mangrove community enhances value as habitat, as well as increasing structural complexity with different root systems and enhancing its ability for shoreline protection and sediment accretion. So right now we are securing funding, doing some siting and scoping for placing a nursery, as well as going through necessary permitting and identifying collection sites for propagules seeds on Guam. Next year, we hope to collect those seeds of propagules, bring them here to Saipan, and establish a nursery and begin propagation. And then 2023 onward, continued nursery maintenance and propagation, as well as outplanting at selected sites and monitoring our revegetation. So, we're excited for this project in the early stages. So we're interested if anyone wants to share information, has questions, concerns, expertise they want to share, please contact either of us for our projects, our contact information there. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll open it up for questions.